Running a business comes with a lot of what-ifs. But luckily, there's a simple answer to them. Shopify. It's the commerce platform behind millions of businesses, including Thrive Cosmetics and Momofuku, and it'll help you with everything you need. From website design and marketing to boosting sales and expanding operations, Shopify can get the job done and make your dream a reality. Turn those what-ifs into... Sign up for your $1 per month trial at shopify.com/special offer.
It's Halloween on Disney+. Watch frightful family favorites like Hocus Pocus and Tim Burton's The Nightmare Before Christmas on Disney+.
I am the Pumpkin King!
Then take the terror to 10 with a thrilling new remake of The Hand That Rocks the Cradle, Scream, and more with Halloween on Disney+. All these and more screaming this Halloween season with Hulu on Disney+. Bundle subscription required. 18+. Select Hulu content via Disney+. Additional content on Hulu app. Terms apply. Visit disneyplus.com/Hulu for details.
Говорит Москва.
If you can hear me, take an encryption button off the trial.
Hello, True Spies listeners. Welcome back to True Spies Debrief. Here on the Debrief, we catch up with experts from the intelligence and espionage community for a deeper look at the themes, events, and insights that fascinate them, taking you behind some of the world's most consequential, dangerous, and outlandish missions. Brett Janis went to work for the CIA in Southeast Asia in 1996. Just a year later, a financial crisis in Thailand began to spread across the region, with ripple effects across the entire globe. In this debrief, we speak with Brett about the CIA's role in helping the US government to understand and manage financial crises, to get an insider's look at an aspect of espionage few outsiders know about. And we also talk about another global crisis, one that, for Brett, hits close to home.
Brett, thank you for being here. I want to start by talking a little bit about, you've had a really interesting career arc. You went to Harvard, and after graduating, you became a journalist, primarily in Bangkok, if I'm correct.
Correct, yes.
You then began working as an intelligence analyst at the CIA. That was in 1996, which was a year before the Asian financial crisis began. And I'm curious what attracted you to the agency as opposed to sort of a more typical employer.
Sure, yeah. So after I lived a few years in Asia, I studied Chinese in Taiwan. I also, as you mentioned, worked in Bangkok for an English language business newspaper. But I did go to graduate school at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. They have a really compelling master's degree program called the Master's in Science and Foreign Service. And so I did an internship at the Cairo embassy, and I generally just got to know people involved in the intelligence services there. A gentleman who is a long way back, his name was Tony Lake, was a professor there, but he was a former head of the CIA. So spoke to him a little bit and just got involved with the recruiting process. It's quite a lengthy process, so it's an advantageous moment when you're in grad school to go through all of those polygraphs and various items. So, and I would say that it was also just driven by the needs of the agency at the time. So I did speak Thai, not ultimately as well as I do now, but I had some Thai language background. I knew the region. I sort of hit the parameters of joining the Office of Southeast Asian Affairs, specifically what's called the Directorate of Intelligence, which is not the operations group, but more of the people that do things like the President's Daily Brief and other sort of reporting for the principals.
So this was 1996. This was shortly before the start of the Asian financial crisis. And for listeners who might not remember, can you sort of refresh our memory about how that crisis got started and also how it spread across so many different countries in the region?
Yeah. So, this was one of the, first major financial crises of like the post-war era. And it really tested sort of the institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, the Treasury Department. And it was fundamentally about most of these high growth economies having their currencies pegged to the US dollar. And that was just not a sustainable solution. So when they were forced to sort of devalue their currencies, that created a lot of chaos with the banking sector. There's certain aspects of crises that are often repeated. In this case, it was banks lending, in a non-prudent manner, just over excessive building and non-productive assets. A lot of these issues still are really exigent in places like China, but back then it was Thailand, South Korea, Indonesia. A lot of them are U.S. allies. So, I think we were, as a country, from a national security perspective, keen to help our allies sort of keep the promise of capitalism going in terms of the stability of these societies. And then in many cases, there were threats to whether countries, particularly Indonesia, would continue to exist as a modern nation. So Indonesia is a huge country, the largest Muslim country on the planet by population. And so helping them and working with the governments was sort of the remit there. And as the size of their economies, it was quite impactful. I mean, it literally took them a decade, 2 decades to sort of get out of a lot of these issues.
And talk to me about the U.S.'s role. Can you speak a little bit more? Because I understand that the U.S. and the IMF are sort of working hand in hand. Can you sort of spell out what that looks like?
Yeah, so the international agencies in Washington, particularly the IMF, they were like the UN, was created after World War II, and the mission is to, promote stability in the global economy. And so they have a very important mission, in my view, but they are in Washington, and the U.S. is a major voice there. For example, when I was working at CAA, the main client that I had was U.S. Treasury. And so aid packages, support efforts that we have, we want to have the best information possible to do that. And so the role of the intelligence services is to keep the policymakers informed. And at that time, the 3 people that were most impactful was Rob Rubin, who was Treasury Secretary, Larry Summers, who was at Treasury, and then Tim Geithner, who had gone to high school in Bangkok, actually, when he was earlier in his career, and just kind of had an understanding of Thailand, its importance, other countries there. So it was, I think, the Committee to Save the World, or they had some name for it, but they walked away feeling like we had some success stabilizing those economies. South Korea in particular is another one where we do have a lot of military assets, North Korea over the border. So having a healthy South Korea, successful South Korea is really an important objective. And just in terms of like the role of intelligence, it's to use all sources. So yes, you have access to clandestine information, what is behind the scenes in terms of some political issues, but a lot of the information is available publicly. Financial markets are huge. They have lots of players. So the analytic challenge, I think, is a little bit different than what we call hard targets, right? Where you're doing something that's, a nuclear program or something that actively the state is trying to hide. Pre 9/11, I think the agency, there was a moment in history where, the mission of the agency was a little bit broader. So there was a lot of resources just to follow what was considered U.S. soft power. So it was just it's part of the end of the Clinton era.
You're describing what sounds like it's human to OSINT, what we refer to as human intelligence gathering and an open source intelligence gathering. Could you give me sort of a sense of what a day-to-day might look like for you?
Sure. It's really helpful to be at the embassies, right? So while I was in Langley, Virginia, the main CIA headquarters, I think having contact, at least working with foreign service officers in different parts of the region was really important. And the State Department has just, great economists, really smart people. I would say one of the greatest pleasures of working in government was just the quality of the people working there. So liaisoning with different parts of the intelligence services, but also State Department was quite critical. Everyone has like different insights that we can bring to bear. And then if CIA is doing their job, we are organizing that and delivering the core messages to the principals so that they can make the best decisions. And so I was briefed at the White House a few times. I had a chance to meet former President George Bush, Herbert Walker Bush. He was, obviously post his career as the former head of CIA, but also as president. Former presidents do get through their travels and just work certain insights. So I had a chance to meet him and speak to him and talk to him about the region. That was one of the highlights of my time there.
Can you say more about that? What was so, I mean, it was just the celebrity of it or the conversation itself?
He's just a real patriot, number one, and real friend of the agency because he was the head of the CIA for a period of time. And so he has his family home in Kennebunkport, and he just has great insights. I think of all the former presidents, he's one that I would just call out as just a really, thoughtful person.
So, America's response in 1997 is not completely without controversy. And you have spoken publicly about the sort of considerations that the country has had to balance in response to an economic crisis elsewhere in the world, not just to preserve financial stability, but also social stability. And I'm curious if while you were at the agency, you ever perceived yourself as doing sort of a tight wire act in order to maintain that balance between the various interests of the U.S. and also the good of the countries that were at the eye of the storm.
Yeah, it's always a balancing act. I think we live in a world of grays and nuances. And, in this case, for this set of issues, it's about, keeping peace and having good economic outcomes. It's not necessarily antagonistic. So that's why we get a lot of cooperation from the other countries, including intelligence cooperation. And as part of any crisis, there's always bad actors, right? So how do other actors try to take advantage of a situation of instability? So perennial issues such as sanctions and money laundering and around any region, there's always countries which are not, supportive of U.S. policy, managing through that. That's part of the goals too. And things happen simultaneously. You can have an economic crisis, which is the main theme, but, in Cambodia in the late 90s, a lot of it was still cleaning up some of the problems with the Khmer Rouge. So if anyone remembers that horrible situation, we also we're charged with bringing some of those individuals to justice or bringing closure for a lot of those people. But that's a whole other theme. But so the idea is there's a lot that's happening in the world at the same time. I will say a lot of these sort of insights and skills was the reason why I went back to government and actually worked for U.S. Treasury for a period of time, because the crisis that happened was the global financial crisis. It was later, but that involved ourselves and other major nations. So, the idea that I had served Treasury and fire sale dynamics, we'll call them, happen in countries was really important to think through when it came to our own crisis that was also banking sector driven with, mortgages and so forth.
Right. You used the phrase tested institutions like the IMF earlier in this conversation. And I'm curious if, knowing that you returned to government work later on, if your experience in Asia, how it influenced your perspective working for the Treasury.
What we set up, the institutions that we set up after World War II are, in my view, very important. I think the challenges are not ending. And if we just fast forward to today, I think they're as severe as they've ever been. So if we don't have institutions, then we don't have sustained programs. Administrations, 4 years is a very short time for a lot of these themes to play out. So the staying power of intelligence services, of just, government employees in general, they need to serve different administrations. And so policies change, but having institutional memory, expertise, I think is very important to inform the democratically elected leaders. I mean, the reason why I had success, I think, was I followed Thailand better than, the principals had time to do, right? Or I followed certain issues. And even if it's a 5-minute summary of that, of years of work or a whole set of issues and complexity, just to be able to deliver that and make a slightly better decision or materially better decision, that's the role, in my view, of intelligence and just good hygiene. There's many examples, right? The business of intelligence is years in the making, but it may only be proven at a certain moment. We can get even more dramatic, but it comes to the work that you've done, the insights you've had, and the relationships you have over long periods of time. And keeping that in some sort of institutional memory, whether it's at CIA or IMF or other places, and that's important. That's my soapbox speech for the role of institutions for your listeners.
I appreciate it. So you left the agency shortly before 9/11, and I'm curious if there was a particular reason that you left at that time?
Yes, there was. So I was offered a role to do a little bit more military work in Bosnia. That was like my next gig. And then I had another opportunity just to continue with like banking sector reworks in the private sector. And so about 2 months before 9/11, I chose to go back, leave government, move to Asia, Hong Kong, and then Bangkok for private practice. But sort of a twist of fate, I delayed that decision 2 months. I probably would have stayed just because 9/11 certainly changed the whole kind of mission statement. It clarified this around terrorism. It was lots of efforts went into that. So most likely that gig in Bosnia would have been converted to something that was 9/11 related, and I would have certainly stayed through that period of time. But I did go back, as I mentioned, after, significant time in Asia to serve again when the Financial Stability Council was set up post GFC. And the gentleman who was Treasury Secretary at the time was Timothy Geithner. So there was that sort of personal connection with him that gave me the confidence that what's called the FSOC was the right place to be. And Financial Stability Oversight Council. So it has a funky acronym, as many things in government have. One of the Dodd-Frank reforms was to set up a council so that all the regulators, the domestic regulators, could speak regularly together. So it's not just the Fed, it's the SEC, this, CFPB, other agencies. And so the council brings together those heads of regulatory agencies and they compare notes and hopefully have better policy because it's not siloed. So similar challenge to intelligence is with, banking financial regulation. If you're not talking to other people, you're missing key trends, right? Because you just don't have a full picture of the financial landscape. And FSOC's still running and they have an important mission going forward. Good times always see the risks of, future crises. So there's always froth in markets and the FSOC is there to help bring us through those times.
I don't want to let you go without talking about Ukraine. I know that your wife is Ukrainian and you have followed this conflict closely, so I would be remiss to let you go without asking you about it. I'm curious how long you believe that Russia can continue to be financially resilient. In fact, I was just reading today that the IMF estimated Russia's GDP actually grew 3.6% in 2024. And I'm also curious how effective you think that Western sanctions have been.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for fast forwarding us to like the challenge of our time. So the last 3 years have been, a real challenge to Western democracies. Ukraine is, a principal battleground of that. And I do feel passionate about it for multiple reasons. I do have family members who are Ukrainian. I've spent a lot of time in Ukraine. It's just such a fantastic society that's, emerging to be an independent country. It is a fairly young country, but to be challenged by Putin in this manner is horrific. So I'm just philosophically, this is an important battle that we win. And there's lots of ways that we can assist, but you are right by that sort of nature of your question. I do not think that sanctions have had much impact at all. I think they've been quite weak, quite timid. There has been some. It's mostly around the energy sector. But for the first, 3 years of the war, that clearly has not impacted much of Russia's thinking. And that's because they have major buyers called India and China out there that are perfectly willing to, take Russian energy resources. And even Europe, I'd say there's been a process to get less and less purchases of energy. But even today, you have, countries like Hungary that are still purchasing Russian gas. So the size of Russia is really the problem, right? I mean, and plus they have built their economy to be quite self-sufficient, and they have many allies that are large economies. I'm heartened by some of the what I would consider stronger sanctions, such as what was recently announced on India, 50% tariffs. But that's sort of just one tactical example. What about China? What about like other ways of enforcement? I mean, sometimes the real problem is also enforcement related. So you can have whatever policy you want, and if it's not enforced robustly, doesn't really matter. And in the case of Russian oil, I'd say there's some enforcement through different channels, like, freezing bank accounts and so forth, but not something that is really forceful. We can do a lot more there.
Some of what you're describing when it comes to Russia's relationship with India and China is of a piece with this term that we're hearing all the time now, this financial fragmentation piece. And I wonder if you worry that the countries that have historically been antagonistic to American and European interests are now weakening our leverage in a way that might ultimately be irreparable.
That's a huge issue. I mean, it's the challenge of our time, right? I mean, absolutely, financial fragmentation is the threat now of some of the more robust responses. So a country like India is, traditionally sort of like that third wheel. It's not, they have relationships with both Russia and China, but the U.S. relationship is important. So there are huge dangers of the U.S., losing its role as a leader by, pressuring major countries. And I tell you, one evidence of the threat here is just the price of gold. So if you look at what central banks are doing, gold is at an all-time high. It's up 40% this year. That's an indication that there's lots of reasons why gold is up, but one major one is that central banks are buying gold significantly more than they did in the past. And gold is a way for them to build their war chests and be less reliant on the other major asset class, which is U.S. Treasuries. So if you have holdings of gold going up and U.S. Treasuries either stagnant or potentially, problematic for countries, that's just, to me, evidence of a worrying trend. There's always been a threat that the U.S. dollar would not be like the world's global currency. It now is really structurally embedded in a lot of like commodity prices, but that's not necessarily a given. That's a function really of post World War II. And there's other currencies that are vying for that position. They're not close yet, but, they are gaining traction. The Chinese yuan, Africa, for example, and, just other currencies, gold being the one now that I think is really clearly showing the threat of fragmentation. And that fragmentation is happening.
I want to blow your cover now and say that you also work under a pseudonym. You go also by Brett Andrew Strange, and you're a writer of thrillers. You have a new one out, and it is about Ukraine. Can you tell us a little bit about that book?
Yeah, sure. So, one of the ways that I thought it was important to sort of address these issues was through fiction. So I did write a book about this. It's called Eastern Light. It's actually the third in a series of books that follow like recurring characters. And so, fiction is a great way to get people to kind of like feel the experience. Also, you're able to write if you can fictionalize things, then you don't cross a line where it's sensitive. You can sort of leave it more vague and open-ended for people. And it's more about the experience of the war. So the book follows two brothers. They're both Iraqi war veterans. And one of them decides to join the International Foreign Legion in Ukraine, what his experiences are there. And then there's a female character who's, a Russian dissident, who's a recurring character who sort of has to manage the challenges of the Ukraine conflict, what it means to be Russian, and be involved with that. And then a little bit of like the post-traumatic issues that a lot of people experience, particularly children. So the last part of the book talks about the adoption of a Ukrainian girl and what that means for her experiences when she leaves Ukraine. It does follow sort of espionage genre plot-driven items, but I wanted to write it in a manner that was like high realism and also, hit a lot of the themes of war that I, feel compelled to write about. So if anyone's looking to read that and understand different points of view. There's a lot of points of view from the villains. So I think the ability of fiction is to create multiple points of view where you can get inside the head of the villains, because most villains don't think that they themselves are villains. So that was really an interesting sort of experiment. And I think it's got great reviews, and I'm happy to have written it, and hope people get something from it.
Great. Well, I wish you luck with it, and I'm grateful to you for being here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for having me on. Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed that conversation between Brett Janis and True Spies producer Morgan Childs. More debriefs are available exclusively to SPYSCAPE Plus subscribers. You'll also be able to access other premium series, like The Razumov Files, our ambitious retelling of Joseph Conrad's Under Western Eyes. And for true crime fans, there's The Great James Bond Car Robbery, the story of the hunt for James Bond's most notorious set of wheels. Subscribers also get new episodes of True Spies early and ad-free. Subscribe to SPYSCAPE Plus at plus.spyscape.com. Disclaimer. The views expressed in this podcast are those of the subject. These stories are told from their perspective, and their authenticity should be assessed on a case-by-case basis. If you're enjoying this podcast, please click now to give it a 5-star rating or leave a review. Ratings and reviews help people discover the podcast and help us bring you more great stories. And if you have some time, why not forward the podcast to a friend?
I think most of the pressure I felt personally, and I think the investigative team, came from the thought that these bad actors were coming over here, stealing some of their most significant intellectual property to take back to benefit their own companies, in this case back in China, back in Beijing. That added a significant amount of pressure because, as I said, some of these products that they were targeting and stealing were worth millions of dollars. And so that also added a fair amount of pressure in this case.
But most of the suspects, most importantly Dr. Lee, were in China, out of reach.
True Spies, the classics, from SPYSCAPE Studios. Search for True Spies wherever you get your podcasts.